Now that we have recorded some instruments and some MIDI sort of information, let's now record some actual audio. And there are a few different ways that we can do this in FL Studio. Again, keeping with kind of that flexible mindset that we've had elsewhere. And I started up a fresh project so that we can just see this and this alone. I will make a quick pattern so that we have something to record over in the playlist. And quick save the project file as anything really. I'll say test, and that will be just the title of this project. And I did change my audio driver since I'm going to have to run this a little bit differently than how I would normally be recording a video. I sometimes have trouble when using the FL Studio ASIO. I instead use my actual Focusrite driver for this purpose, since sometimes you get some weird latencies and things can be a little bit funny when they are operating. So whatever you have for your audio interface, it's good to get a driver for it. When you're on Windows anyway, Mac handles things a little bit differently, but you'll just want to set your buffer settings so that you have enough latency for your computer to run correctly, but also not too much where it's going to feel weird recording at too much of a delay. So to sort of show that, we're going to go into the mixer, and I'm going to just select a track. I'll pick Insert 5, and I'll call that Voice. And then I'm going to go over to the track inspector over on the right to select an actual input here. And we just go into this drop-down. I have my microphone plugged into input 1, and when I do this, we'll start to get a sound, a double of my voice. I'm going to turn it down so I'm not interfering with my other recording right now, but essentially what we're doing is just feeding an input from my audio interface into this track. And in a similar way to how we recorded MIDI, we're just going to record this audio. And to do so, you do have to have this arm for record button enabled. So when it's red, it's enabled. The track turns a little bit purple. When it's blue like this, it just means that there is an input. And so it does have some sound going into it. But with it armed, you could have it actually be able to be recorded when it's at a level and also turned on for the recording. And even at the settings I had for my buffer length on the driver, I could still get a hint of latency, and there was a bit of a delay, but it wasn't enough that it was unmanageable. If I had it at like 10 seconds and I listened to myself, the playback from when I talk to when I hear it is a little bit less than ideal, and that can kind of throw you off if you're doing something rhythmically, especially, such as music. And so if you're running a system that might not be as strong CPU-wise, you might add in some of these other buffer settings that will make your overall latency longer than it should be to be able to record effectively. But if you're running a good system, you can keep it pretty low and still be able to record without any real issues. I'll leave it at 3 milliseconds, so there's still a little bit of latency, but enough that I can still hear myself and not be too thrown off by it. And juggling those latencies is basically the only tedious part of this. The rest of it is pretty straightforward. So we'll close out of our settings and make sure that this track is selected and that it's also armed. And then I'm going to go up to the top here to the same record button. If I click it, I'll have that same dialog box come up. And if I say audio into the playlist as audio clip, I will do just as it says. It'll record my audio into the playlist. And I actually should probably turn up the volume for that to actually work. And now with it, like that, I'll say audio into playlist. 1, 2, 3, 4. And now I have my audio. You can see the waveform in the playlist being recorded. And that automatically routed this track straight out of the master track. And it's in the playlist as an audio clip. We can see it, drag it around, do anything as we would there, slice it up, and we have it there. It saves it into the directory. If we click this button here, it will find it in the browser for us. It's in this recorded folder, which we can open up and see whatever sorts of WAV files that we have recorded onto. Right now, there's just the one that I have in there because that's the only one I've recorded. But we have ourselves a track. And if we wanted to record a bunch of other ones, we could go to another area. We still have all those settings set up in the recording. We'll reset this so it's back up and make sure that we have that track selected again. We count off, and we can hear a couple of things happening. I'm kind of double tracking a number of things. That's kind of not a musical experience we're going through here. It's just a bunch of talking over myself. But you could see how you could use this in a straightforward multi-tracking environment. And I'll just mute these tracks right now. And we'll take a look here and we'll go through how we can do loop recording. Double click and drag up here to select an area you would want to loop. I'll do just one bar. and I'll go up and select the loop recording button in this top toolbar. And now when we press play, I'll turn off the counting because I don't really need to count this off. We're going to start to have a number of different recordings. I didn't bring up my vocal, but if I want that up, I can now see the waveforms that are recording. It's going to add in different tracks every time, and they're parented so that they're together. And so you could do a bunch of different takes very quickly for whatever specific part you're trying to loop over. And like I said, these are grouped together. You can shift and scroll to move them around, collapse them, and they are also muted. So just one of them you can have open at a time. I can double right click and drag to unmute one of them. I'll turn off the recording, add in different tracks every time, and that's pretty simple. I'll hold right Alt and then click it to mute it. That does the same thing as double right clicking and dragging. But that's cool for just recording a dry sound. But let's say we want to add in some effects to my voice. Maybe I want a reverb on there. I'll just find a reverb. You could add a ton of it, and when I bring up this sound, you'll get that reverb introduced on my sound. I could even do that with a delay, and now I'm very spacious. And that's a bit extreme, but that sort of thing can come in handy, like if a singer wants to have a bit of reverb as they're monitoring themselves or something along those lines. But when you're doing that, do note that these will add in a bit of latency. Depending on the effect, it might be enough that it could be a problem. And another thing that you want to remember when doing this is that with this button, you can record post or pre effects. So if you do post, it will record this audio signal as it goes out with all the effects applied. So if I just record something over here, I'll bring this sound up, and then I will record into the playlist. It'll count me off, and now I'm getting some effects. I'll turn down and solo this track. I was loop recording, so it muted it. Double right click and drag to unmute, turn off recording, and now I'm getting some effects. And you can see that that is the take as I did it with all the effects applied. But if I wanted to have that with just the dry sound, I could click here and do pre and go through the exact same process here. I'll turn it up and hit the record, place it as audio clip. There we go. I'm recording that same thing. I'll bring it back down. We'll double click on that clip, and you'll see that it is routed to the track here instead of to the master as the other one was. And this means that the dry sound will go into the track and through the effects, but it itself is dry. So I'll solo the playlist track with it on it, turn off recording, and just listen through, bringing it up. There we go. I'm recording. And that's the take I just did, but I could go ahead and mute the effects with this button, and then all the effects on this mixer insert are bypassed. I will have to bring it up, and then I can play that same thing without anything applied. There we go. I'm recording. So the recording itself is dry without any effects applied, but then it's going back into that same mixer track where the effects are that I originally heard because I had pre-selected here. And so it's a pretty simple setup as far as recording goes. Right-clicking on the recording button, you can see all of the different things that we had more or less for notes and automation, except for audio is selected. You don't really have to worry too much about any of the other options when doing audio, since you're just going straight into the playlist. But there is another way to do it without going into the playlist. We can add in an effect, which is actually a recorder. We'll select the Edison, and this is just like how you'd have a recording program, a little insert, kind of similar to the program Audacity, but as a plugin in FL Studio. So if we go down and enable our effects, since Edison is just an effect like everything else, you can see that we do have a sound going through, and we'll bring up the sound. We can hit record, and we're recording anything going through this track. And that's even if the volume is down, I'm still recording whatever it is going through there. I have the effects on, I could turn the effects off, and we're still recording anything that we have. So in Edison, we can export this sample, save it as, and just put it in with samples, or save it wherever on your computer you want to put it. And even without saving, you can take this, and there's a button. Anytime you see this, again, you can copy and drag that on here, and now I have that sample, the same one that I recorded on Edison. Right here in the playlist, we can click and play this track, and that's going through there, and we're still recording anything that we have. So that's a cool way to be able to record separate things, or even record like if your volume is down, anything like that, and be able to work with this even in the Edison right here. So you could delete part of it or normalize your sound in Edison, but we won't get too deep into working with Edison since it is its own plugin. But just as it is, you can definitely tell the good use that you can get out of it. And these few techniques definitely are suited for different situations in different areas. Like obviously you'd want to record into the playlist if you're going to be recording over like a loop track and you want to get instruments over it or vocals over it. That makes plenty of sense to do it that way. But if you're recording just something, a voiceover, maybe you could just do it into the Edison and then drag it into the playlist or work with it that way, cut it up, whether it be pre or post effects, however you want to set that up. Because being that it is an effect, we could just put it before the effects in the chain, so above them, and then even if the effects were on, you would be recording the dry signal because as far as FL Studio is concerned, the signal going through the Edison has not reached the part where these delays and reverbs are added. So that's something cool also about this, is you could put them in between effects at that point. It's not just pre or post, so that's plenty good. Additionally, if you wanted to have multiple tracks going, you could have two inputs. I don't have anything plugged into my second input right now, but if they're both armed to record, and I hit record, nothing's going to record right now, but we'll have the effects on. I can turn the effects off, and we're still recording. A lot of recordings of me saying things, but there are these two blank tracks that we just recorded from those two armed tracks, currently empty since this one was turned all the way down and there's nothing routed in here, but it recorded both of those tracks at the same time. So as with most things in FL Studio, it is a little bit different than how you could expect it to be if you were just working in a studio or something like that, but it's not that different, and you can kind of streamline the differences to essentially work the same way. Again, kind of keeping with the open-ended, flexible sort of nature of FL Studio. And I've recorded bands, I've recorded vocalists, instrumentalists, anything like that in here, and if you're just jumping in, you can flow with it pretty easily and kind of get the groove of how everything else in FL Studio works together in this kind of manner. And like a lot of other things, there's a lot more we could get into in recording audio and editing audio in FL Studio, but to consider it at a beginner's level, this is a good taste and understanding of the basics and even a little bit further than that. So with that, we're going to call this good and move on into automation in the next video, so I will see you then.